Hey everyone, welcome back to the deep dive. You know the drill, like, subscribe, that bell icon, all that good stuff. Now, are you ready for a deep dive into a topic that's absolutely crucial, especially for all you UPSC aspirants out there?
You bet. We're talking biodiversity. It's a big one, and it pops up everywhere in those exams.
It really does.
Huh?
And it's not just for the exams. It's for understanding our world.
Right, absolutely. Biodiversity is basically the incredible variety of life on Earth.
I mean, we're talking about everything from the tiniest bacteria you can't even see
Yeah.
to those giant blue whales, right?
Exactly. And it all plays this massive role in keeping our planet healthy and, livable for us humans.
Okay, so we get the general idea.
Yeah.
But there's got to be a more official way to define biodiversity. Like, what do the textbooks say?
Well, the United Nations defines biodiversity as the variability among living organisms from all sources, including, terrestrial, marine, and those other aquatic ecosystems, and the ecological complexes of which they are part. This includes diversity within species, between species, and of ecosystems.
Okay, that's quite a mouthful,
Right.
but it's super important, especially for anyone new to the topic. So let's break it down.
All right. Imagine a three-layered cake.
I like where this is going.
The first layer is genetic diversity.
So all the different genes within a single species.
Exactly. Think about all the different dog breeds. From a Chihuahua, tiny little thing, to a massive Great Dane.
All one species. But their genes give them, like, totally different looks and personalities.
Exactly. That's genetic diversity in action. It's the ingredients that make each individual unique.
So genetic diversity, the first layer of our cake. What's the second layer?
Species diversity. This is about the variety of different species living in a particular area.
Okay, so like picture a coral reef with all those colorful fish and corals.
Perfect example.
Yeah.
That's species diversity at its finest.
Got it. So we've got genetic diversity, species diversity. What's the final layer?
The final layer is ecosystem diversity.
So all the different habitats, communities, and ecological processes.
Exactly. From lush rainforests to dry deserts, each one's unique.
Okay, so all three layers, genetic, species, and ecosystem diversity, they're all connected and essential for a healthy planet, right?
Absolutely.
So we know biodiversity is super important, but how is it distributed? Like, is it the same everywhere on Earth?
Not at all. There are these patterns we see in biodiversity. One of the most well-known is the latitudinal gradient.
Latitudinal gradient. Okay, break that down for me.
Basically, biodiversity decreases as you move away from the equator towards the poles.
So like, the closer you are to the equator, the more diverse the life?
Exactly.
And why is that? What makes those tropical regions so special?
Well, they've been relatively undisturbed for millions of years, which means species had more time to evolve and diversify. Their climates are generally stable, which favors specialization. And, they get a ton of solar energy, which means more productivity, which indirectly supports more species.
So the tropics are like the biodiversity hotspots of the world.
They are.
Okay, that makes sense. But how do scientists measure biodiversity? Like, how do they compare different regions?
Well, there are a few ways, but two key concepts are species richness and species evenness.
Okay, tell me about those.
Species richness is basically just the number of different species in an area.
So just counting how many different types of plants and animals are there?
Exactly. Species evenness goes a step further. It looks at how evenly distributed those different species are.
Okay, give me an example.
Sure. Imagine two forests, both with 100 trees.
Right, I'm picturing it.
Now, Forest A has 90 trees of one species and just 10 of another.
Okay, so pretty unbalanced.
Right. Forest B has 50 trees of each species. Forest B has greater species evenness because, the individuals are more evenly spread out.
I see. So both species richness and species evenness matter.
They do.
Now, let's talk about India. We mentioned it's one of the most biodiverse countries in the world.
It is. We're talking over 45,000 species of plants and 91,000 species of animals. It's one of the world's 17 megadiverse countries.
Megadiverse. That sounds serious.
It means India has a huge chunk of the world's biodiversity, even though it only covers a relatively small area. We're talking almost 7% of all recorded species on Earth.
That's a big responsibility. And we've got those 4 biodiversity hotspots, right?
You got it. The Himalayas, the Western Ghats, the Northeast, and the Nicobar Islands. These are areas packed with endemic species you won't find anywhere else.
Endemic species meaning?
They're unique to that specific area.
Got it. So these hotspots are super important for conservation.
They are.
What makes these hotspots so special?
Well, the Himalayas, with their mountains and varying altitudes, create all sorts of habitats, from meadows to forests. The Western Ghats on the coast get tons of rain, supporting these lush evergreen forests. The Northeast is kind of isolated geographically, so it has its own unique mix of species. And the Nicobar Islands' tropical climate, isolated, they've got their own unique flora and fauna.
It's like each hotspot has its own personality.
You could say that.
Okay, so we talk hotspots, but what about India's different regions? What makes them so biodiverse?
Well, India's got diverse physical features and climates, which results in all sorts of ecosystems, from forests and wetlands to grasslands, deserts, and coastal and marine ecosystems.
Like a mini world of ecosystems.
Exactly. And to understand this even better, we can look at India's biogeographic zones.
Okay, biogeographic zones, what are those?
Think of them as large regions with similar features: geography, climate, plants, animals, that sort of thing.
So like dividing India into different ecological regions.
Exactly. And then within these zones, we have biogeographic provinces, even smaller subdivisions with even more unique characteristics.
Wow, India's really got it all.
And then there are biomes, major ecological communities like tropical rainforests, deserts, alpine meadows. You get the idea.
Okay, I'm starting to see the bigger picture here.
Do it.
It's like a giant, intricate web of life, all connected and influencing each other. Okay, so we've explored the incredible diversity of life, especially in India. But now for the big question. What are the threats to this incredible web of life?
That's the million-dollar question. And unfortunately, biodiversity is facing some serious threats, most of them driven by us humans. The big ones are habitat loss and fragmentation, overexploitation of resources, invasive alien species, and co-extinctions.
Okay, those sound pretty serious. Let's break them down, starting with habitat loss and fragmentation.
Sure. Imagine you're a tiger living in this huge forest. Suddenly, humans start cutting down trees, building roads, and turning your home into farmland or cities. Your habitat shrinks, and what's left gets chopped up into little islands.
So it's like taking a giant puzzle and scattering the pieces, making it harder to put the picture back together.
Exactly. And this fragmentation makes it harder for species to survive. It's tougher to find food, mates, shelter, and they become more vulnerable to disease and predators.
That's really sad. Okay, what about overexploitation?
Well, humans have always relied on natural resources, right? But when we take more than nature can replenish, that's overexploitation. Think overfishing, poaching, unsustainable logging.
So we're basically taking more than our fair share.
Right. And it not only affects the targeted species, but it throws the whole ecosystem out of balance.
Okay, next up, invasive alien species.
Mm.
What are those and how are they a threat?
These are species that have been introduced either intentionally or accidentally to areas where they don't belong.
Like they're not supposed to be there.
Right. And they can cause all sorts of problems. They compete with native species, prey on them, spread diseases, and even change entire ecosystems.
Can you give us an example?
Sure. Think about water hyacinth clogging up waterways or lantana kermera taking over forests. They can be devastating.
Yuck. Okay, the last threat, co-extinctions. What does that even mean?
Co-extinctions happen when one species goes extinct, and it causes other species that depend on it to also disappear.
Oh, wow, so it's like a domino effect.
Exactly. It's a chain reaction of loss.
This is all pretty bleak. It feels like we're losing biodiversity at an alarming rate.
The situation is serious, but we'll talk about conservation efforts and what we can do to protect biodiversity in the next part. Welcome back, everyone. So before we jump into India's amazing biodiversity, let's talk about ecosystem services.
Ecosystem services. Sounds interesting.
Basically, these are all the amazing things that ecosystems do for us humans, the benefits we get from nature, essentially for free.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Give me an example.
Think about forests. They regulate our climate, they absorb carbon dioxide, release oxygen. They even influence rainfall patterns.
So forests are like giant air purifiers and climate control systems all rolled into one.
Pretty much. And then you've got wetlands. They're like natural sponges. They filter pollutants and protect us from floods.
Okay, so forests and wetlands are doing their part. What else?
Pollinators, bees, butterflies, they ensure we get all those delicious fruits and vegetables. And these are just a few examples. Ecosystem services are essential for, well, everything. Human health, well-being, even our economy.
Wow, nature's pretty amazing when you think about it. It's like a giant support system we often take for granted.
Exactly.
Okay, so ecosystem services check. Now, let's explore India's incredible biodiversity. Ready for a whirlwind tour?
Absolutely. Let's start with plants. India is a botanist's dream. We're talking algae, fungi, lichens, bryophytes, pterophytes, chionosperms, and angiosperms, you name it.
Whoa, that's a lot of plant groups.
Right. We've got everything from towering trees to delicate wildflowers.
Speaking of unique plants, what about those insectivorous plants? They always fascinated me.
Ah, yes. They're amazing examples of adaptation. In nutrient-poor soils, they've evolved to trap and digest insects for extra nutrients.
It's like nature's version of a science fiction movie.
Right. Nature's full of surprises.
Okay, so plants check.
Yeah.
What about animals? India is famous for its iconic wildlife, right?
Absolutely. Let's start with the mammals. Of course, we've got the Bengal tiger,
The king of the jungle.
but it doesn't stop there. Elephants, rhinoceroses, leopards, bears, all sorts of deer, and that's just in the plains and forests. Up in the Himalayas, you've got species adapted to the high altitudes, like the snow leopard and the Himalayan brown bear.
It's like a wildlife documentary waiting to happen. What about the bird life? I've heard India has some incredible birds.
It does. Over 1,200 species, many of which are migratory. They travel thousands of kilometers, to escape harsh winters or to breed. India's diverse habitats provide crucial stopover points for these birds.
It's amazing how they navigate those long journeys.
It is. And we can't forget the reptiles, amphibians, and the countless invertebrates all contributing to India's rich tapestry of life.
It's mind-boggling to think about the sheer variety of life out there.
It is.
And it's not just about individual species, it's about how they all interact with each other in their environment.
Right. Exactly. Each species plays a role in the grand scheme of things. That brings us to another cool aspect of biodiversity, the different types of species and the roles they play.
Okay, tell me more about that.
Well, you've got keystone species, indicator species, flagship species, umbrella species.
Whoa, it's a lot of categories. What's a keystone species?
A keystone species is a species that has a huge impact on its ecosystem, even if there aren't that many of them.
So like a small but mighty kind of thing.
Yeah, think of it like the keystone in an archway. Remove that one stone and the whole arch collapses. That's how important they are.
Got it. What about indicator species?
Indicator species are like, well, indicators. They're super sensitive to environmental changes. So if they start to disappear, it's a sign that something's wrong with the ecosystem.
Okay, like an early warning system.
Exactly. And then you've got flagship species, the charismatic ones that everyone loves. They're often used as symbols for conservation efforts.
So like the panda for WWF.
Exactly. And finally, umbrella species. These guys need a lot of space to survive. So if we protect their habitat, we're also protecting a whole bunch of other species that live there.
Okay, so each type of species has its own role to play. This is fascinating. Okay, I'm ready to dive into some specific regions of India now. Let's start with the Himalayas, those majestic mountains.
All right, the Himalayan foothills, they've got these lush subtropical forests. It's like a transition zone between the plains and the high mountains. Elephants, sambar deer, tigers, panthers, even the great Indian one-horned rhinoceros, you can find them all there.
Sounds like a wildlife lover's paradise. What happens as we climb higher into the western Himalayas?
The vegetation changes completely. Rhododendrons, bamboo, birch forests, and these amazing alpine pastures. And the animals change too, of course. You'll find the Tibetan wild goats like the thar and ibex, and if you're lucky, you might even spot a snow leopard.
Wow, that's incredible. And the eastern Himalayas, what's special about them?
Well, they get more rain, so they're even more lush and dense. We're talking rainforests in the eastern Himalayas, red panda, the great one-horned rhinoceros, tigers, snow leopards, clouded leopard. It's an incredible mix.
It sounds like every corner of the Himalayas has something unique to offer.
It does.
Okay, let's move on to peninsular India. What's the biodiversity like there?
Peninsular India has a huge variety of habitats, from dry forests to moist evergreen forests.
So a little bit of everything.
Pretty much. In the north and east, where there's more rain, you find a lot of sal forests. In the south, teak is the dominant tree. And along the western coast, you've got the Western Ghats, another global biodiversity hotspot.
I've heard the Western Ghats are amazing. What makes them so special?
They get a ton of rainfall. So they've got these lush evergreen forests, kind of like the rainforests of northeast India, and they're home to tons of endemic species. Then there's the Nilgiris, these beautiful hills known for their shola forests. little patches of evergreen forest mixed with grasslands.
Yeah, that sounds picturesque. What about the animals in peninsular India?
We've got elephants, wild boars, deer, antelopes, and predators like wild dogs, tigers, leopards, and even striped hyenas.
Wow, it's like a mini safari right here in India.
You could say that.
Okay, we've covered mountains, forests, grasslands.
Yeah.
What about India's deserts?
Deserts might seem harsh and empty, but they're surprisingly diverse.
Really? What kind of plants and animals can survive in such a dry place?
Well, the plants have to be tough. Thorny trees, cacti, succulents, they've all adapted to conserve water.
It's amazing how life finds a way. What about the animals?
Oh, we've got some amazing creatures. The great Indian bustard, black buck, ginkara, foxes, wolves, caracals, the Asiatic wild-ass cat, even desert cats, and of course, lots of reptiles.
It's a whole different world out there in the desert.
It is.
Okay, so we've explored the mountains, forests, grasslands, and even the desert. What about India's rainforests?
Yes, let's not forget those. We've got rainforests in the Western Ghats and in northeastern India.
Rainforests in India. I thought those were only in places like the Amazon.
Nope. The Western Ghats rainforests are known for their amazing diversity. Dense trees, mosses, ferns, orchids. It's a multi-layered habitat teeming with life.
What kind of trees are we talking about?
Ebony, Indian rosewood, teak, Indian laurel, those are some of the big ones. And the wildlife is incredible too. Wild elephants, gar, even the hulak gibbon, which is the only ape found in India.
Wow, that's amazing. And the rainforests in the Northeast, how do they compare?
They're similar in terms of lushness and diversity, but they've got their own unique species. Lots of primates, golden langur, capped langur, the slender loris, which is nocturnal,
It's like a primate party up there. What else is there?
bats, giant squirrels, civets, flying squirrels, mongooses, the spiny mouse. The list goes on.
It's incredible how each region has its own unique mix of species.
It really is.
Okay, we've explored mountains, forests, deserts, rainforests.
Right.
What about India's coastlines? I bet there's a lot of biodiversity there too.
Absolutely. India's coastline is teeming with marine life. One really fascinating example is the Sundarbans.
Ah, the Sundarbans, famous for their tigers, right?
Exactly. It's the world's largest mangrove forest and a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The Royal Bengal tiger, which is the only tiger that swims in saltwater, is the top predator there.
That's amazing. It's like a tiger's water park. What are mangroves, by the way?
Mangroves are these special trees and shrubs that grow in salty water along the coast. They're incredibly important for a whole bunch of reasons. They provide a habitat for all sorts of creatures. They protect the coast from erosion. They filter pollutants. They even help support fisheries.
Wow, they're like the superheroes of the coast.
You could say that.
What other interesting marine creatures can we find in India?
Well, there's the sea cow, or dugong, which is this large, gentle creature that grazes on seagrass. You can find them in places like the Gulf of Mannar, the Gulf of Kach, and the Andaman and Nicobar Islands.
A sea cow?
Right.
That's amazing. I had no idea.
Right. There's so much to discover in our oceans.
This has been an incredible journey through India's biodiversity. But now I'm thinking about all the threats this incredible diversity faces.
You're right. We've explored the amazing variety of life in India, but now we need to talk about the challenges to conserving this biodiversity.
Let's do it. We've already discussed the major threats to biodiversity globally, but how are those threats playing out in India specifically?
One of the biggest challenges, just like globally, is habitat loss and fragmentation.
We talked about this before, but can you remind us how it's affecting India's wildlife?
Sure. India's got a rapidly growing human population and a developing economy. That puts a lot of pressure on natural resources and habitats.
So basically, more people need more space, which often comes at the expense of nature.
Right. Forests are cleared for agriculture, infrastructure, urbanization. It's a constant battle for space.
And it's not just about the amount of space, it's about how fragmented it is, right? Like those isolated patches of forest we talked about earlier.
Exactly. Fragmentation is a big problem, especially for large animals like tigers and elephants that need to roam.
Okay, so habitat loss and fragmentation are major issues. What about overexploitation?
Overexploitation is a huge problem in India. We've got a long history of using natural resources, but in many cases, it's become unsustainable.
Give me some examples.
Overfishing is a big one. Many fish stocks are declining rapidly. And then there's illegal wildlife trade. Tigers, elephants, pangolins, they're all poached for their body parts.
That's so sad. It's all driven by greed, isn't it?
A lot of it is, yeah. And it's not just about the animals themselves. It disrupts ecosystems and makes conservation efforts even harder.
Okay, so we've got habitat loss, fragmentation, overexploitation.
Yeah.
What about invasive alien species?
Invasive species are a growing problem in India, too. They can be introduced intentionally, like for agriculture, or accidentally, like through trade or travel.
And once they're here, they can cause a lot of damage, right?
They can. They outcompete native species, disrupt ecosystems, and can even cause economic damage.
Any examples of invasive species in India?
Water hyacinth, the classic example. It clogs up waterways, reduces oxygen levels, and kills fish. And then there's lantana camara, a thorny shrub that's taken over forests, grasslands, even agricultural lands.
It's amazing how these plants can be so destructive.
Right, and climate change is likely to make the problem even worse.
How so?
Well, changing temperatures and rainfall patterns can create more favorable conditions for invasive species to spread.
Okay, so that's something to watch out for. We've talked about habitat loss, fragmentation, overexploitation, invasive species. What about co-extinctions?
Coextinctions are a less obvious threat, but they're just as important. When one species goes extinct, it can trigger a cascade of extinctions, especially if that species played a key role in the ecosystem.
So it's like a domino effect where one extinction leads to another.
Exactly.
This is all pretty concerning. It feels like we're losing biodiversity at an alarming rate.
The situation is definitely serious, but there's a lot of work being done to conserve biodiversity in India.
That's good to hear. Tell me more about those conservation efforts.
Well, for starters, India has a network of protected areas, national parks, wildlife sanctuaries, biosphere reserves. They all provide legal protection for habitats and species.
Can you give me some examples of those protected areas?
Sure, we've got over 100 national parks, over 500 wildlife sanctuaries, and over 18 biosphere reserves. Some of the most famous national parks include Jim Corbett, Kaziranga, Kanha, Gur, and Bandipur. Each one is known for protecting certain iconic species.
Those are definitely names I've heard before. What about legal protections? Are there any laws in place to protect biodiversity?
Yes, we've got the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972, which prohibits the hunting and trade of endangered species. There are also laws that regulate the use of forests and other natural resources.
So it's not just about protecting animals, it's about protecting their homes, too.
Exactly.
What other approaches are being taken to conserve biodiversity in India?
There's been a growing emphasis on community-based conservation. This means getting local communities involved in conservation efforts.
Because they're the ones living closest to nature.
Right, exactly. They have a huge role to play.
Are there any specific organizations working on conservation in India?
Oh, tons. The Wildlife Trust of India, WWF India, the Bombay Natural History Society. These are just a few of the big ones. They do research, habitat restoration, anti-poaching work, community outreach. They're really making a difference.
It's good to know there are so many people working to protect India's biodiversity.
It is. And of course, the government's involved too through the Ministry of Environment, Forest, and Climate Change.
It sounds like a real team effort.
It is. Conserving biodiversity requires everyone to work together. Government agencies, NGOs, researchers, local communities, and individuals.
So what can individuals do to help?
Every little bit counts. Whether it's planting trees, reducing your consumption, choosing eco-friendly products, supporting conservation organizations, we can all make a difference.
This has been an incredible journey through India's biodiversity. I've learned so much about the variety of life, the threats it faces, and the efforts underway to protect it.
It's been a pleasure sharing this journey with you and our listeners.
Welcome back, everyone, for the final part of our deep dive into biodiversity. We've covered a lot of ground, from the different types of biodiversity to India's amazing variety of life and the threats it faces.
Right. We've looked at the science, the geography, the ecology, but now it's time to talk about the human side of things.
Okay, the human dimension. What do you mean by that?
Well, biodiversity isn't just some abstract concept, you know? It's deeply connected to human societies, cultures, and even economies.
So it's not just about saving species for the sake of saving them. It's about recognizing how our own well-being is tied to a healthy planet.
Exactly. Think about indigenous communities around the world. Many have lived in harmony with nature for centuries. Their cultures, their livelihoods, it's all deeply connected to biodiversity.
So there's a lot we can learn from these communities.
Oh, absolutely. They have this incredible knowledge about plants, sustainable practices, the balance of ecosystems. It's traditional ecological knowledge that's been passed down for generations.
That's really cool. It's like a living library of wisdom about nature.
It is.
Okay, so we got the cultural side of things. What about the economic side? How does biodiversity factor into our global economy?
Well, think about it. Biodiversity underpins a lot of our essential ecosystem services. Clean air, clean water, fertile soil, pollination, all those things have a direct economic value.
It's like nature's providing all these services for free.
Right. And when we lose biodiversity, we're essentially undermining our own economic well-being.
Can you give me some specific examples of how biodiversity loss has impacted economies?
Sure. The decline in pollinators, for example, has had a huge impact on agricultural yields worldwide. Crops aren't getting pollinated as effectively, which means less food. And then there's the destruction of mangrove forests. That's led to increased vulnerability to storms and flooding in coastal communities, which translates to huge economic losses.
So ignoring the value of biodiversity has some pretty serious real-world consequences.
It does.
So what can we do about it? How can we protect and conserve biodiversity?
It's not just about creating protected areas or passing laws, although those are important steps. It's about a change in mindset. We need to recognize that we're part of nature, not separate from it.
So it's like shifting from a human-centered view of the world to a more like Earth-centered perspective.
Exactly. We need to start thinking about the long-term consequences of our actions on the planet.
Okay, that makes sense. But how do we translate that into concrete actions?
Well, we can start with our everyday choices, reducing our consumption, choosing eco-friendly products, supporting sustainable businesses, reducing our carbon footprint. It all adds up.
So being more mindful consumers and trying to lighten our impact on the environment.
Exactly. And we can also get involved in citizen science projects, educate ourselves and others about biodiversity, and advocate for policies that protect our natural heritage.
So becoming informed citizens and taking action.
Exactly. Every little bit helps.
This deep dive into biodiversity has been incredible. I've learned so much about this topic, and I feel even more motivated to do my part to protect our planet's amazing web of life.
I'm glad to hear that. It's been a pleasure sharing this journey with you and our listeners.
And to all our listeners out there, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on future deep dives. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep.